joint work with Stefano Faccini and Marcelo Forets, who are postdocs in Marseille, ex-Marseille University, where I'm from, and Grenoble. Okay, this has given rise to 2 papers. So before I make any grand motivation, I just want to state exactly what the result is, and there is nothing more and nothing less than this result in this talk. Okay. So what this is that I will describe is a numerical scheme in order to simulate a partial differential equation, or rather a class of partial differential equations that are of this kind. So it's a quantum mechanical equation with a Hamiltonian, and the Hamiltonian is of this form. Okay, let's look a bit closer. Basically, it's a transport equation à la Dirac. But here you have a Hermitian, which can be anything. Well, you need to just bound its eigenvalues, just so that if information doesn't propagate faster than the lattice allows it. But basically, you can tune the speeds of the transports here. Okay. Then you have this funny term here, but it's needed when you have a term like that. If you want the whole thing to be Hermitian, then you can prove that you need this term. Okay. And here is C, which can account for some electromagnetic potential or whatever. Okay. This thing here is basically a generalization of the Dirac equation in curved spacetime. If you take the Dirac equation from general relativity and you rewrite it in a Hamiltonian form to exhibit the dynamics along the t coordinate, then you will get to that with slightly more precise things for those BKs, but they are included in this scheme. Okay?
BKs are spatially dependent?
Okay, yes, they will be space-time dependent, if you want. Yes. Right. Okay, and of course, you could just pick up this equation and, I don't know, do a finite difference or something like that. But it wouldn't be so much fun. What the aim of the game is, it's to have a numerical scheme which is made of unitary operations and small unitary operations which you apply locally upon your lattice. Okay? So why would you ever want to do that? For 2 reasons. One is just to make sure that your numerical scheme is stable in a certain norm. I will come back to that. So just good properties of a numerical scheme. And the other reason is because if you do that, then you can claim that this is a quantum algorithm for a quantum simulation device. Okay? You could say, okay, give me some cold atoms in an optical lattice. Then I can move these atoms around, and I can implement this equation. So yes?
Your H contains an I, is that correct?
Yes, this H is Hamiltonian.
So the I cancel from both sides. You don't have anything.
This is Hermitian, and the whole thing is a Hermitian. Yes.
So you have some regularity on the regularity.
Sorry.
You have some regularity necessary on the BK. BK is a function, right? It's a matrix value function.
BK is a field of function.
So it's regular. I mean, it's differentiable.
Yes. Yes.
So you have to have an I, exponential I of the Hermitian to get a unitary matrix. If the I cancel from both sides, you don't have a unitary matrix.
It's Hermitian. It's the Dirac equation. It's Hermitian.
No, but I got confused yesterday night about this precise question, so I don't. But yes, that's the correct thing. Okay. So, okay, I've told you exactly what the result is. So now let me indulge in a more grand motivation, just to have fun. Okay, so turns out that I'm a computer scientist. I've been educated a computer scientist, and in computer science there is this old belief that perhaps the physics and the world we live in might be discrete, and you could divide up space into little cubes and describe the state of each cube by some bits. And because things, information doesn't propagate too fast, well, if I want to compute the state of a cube at t plus 1, then surely it must be a function of the surrounding cubes at the earlier time. So this is discrete time, discrete space. Okay, and so this kind of belief leads to the idea that physicists are people who spend their entire life trying to work out what this little local rule, little f, is that describes the local dynamics of the world. Okay, so this is not what I actually believe in, but I think that this thesis is interesting to evaluate, and so in fact I could say that much of my work has been to produce theorems about the extent in which physics or particles, etc., can be captured in such a formalism. Now, one thing that will not work for sure is if you just put bits there. Okay, we know that there is such thing as quantum mechanics, and we are at least going to have to put qubits or complex numbers, etc. Bell theorem, for instance.
No, but you know that you can write quantum mechanical equations in classical language. You can add non-local hidden variables. So
non-locally, okay. But if we assume locality, then you can't.
But you didn't assume it.
Well, yes, I didn't specifically write it,
Okay.
but I assume it now.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. So, okay. Why this grander motivation, if you like, what do they have to do with such numerical schemes? Well, the thing I like particularly about this thing is that, when you have a numerical scheme that is built up of small local unitary matrices, then you have something that is still fundamentally compatible with quantum mechanics. It's not just any numerical scheme, an FDE that won't preserve your L2 norm or anything. You have something here that is a sort of candidate toy model for the phenomena. Okay. Right. So also I just like this this idea that, well, I must say that 5 years ago I didn't know what the Dirac equation was, and I looked it up in Wikipedia, and I got this thing, and I thought, wow, but what does this say? And I was really longing for the good old times when my father would tell me how the knight moves on a chessboard. He gives me a little algorithm to follow, tack, tack, tack. Okay, and I find that more explanatory, perhaps, than PD is. So I would say that the aim of the game is also to get algorithms to describe phenomena that are more explanatory. Right. So, okay, let's start very simple, just to lay out the formalism, things that are probably rather easy to most of you here. So let's say that we want a chess game for our particles, and we'll simplify things to 1 + 1 dimension. So here is space, here is time, and time is flowing upwards. And okay, let's consider a neutrino and suppose that it neglect the fact that it might have a mass, or okay, just a massless Dirac particle. What does it do? Well, it can move towards the right, or it can move towards the left. Doesn't have much choice. But because it's quantum mechanics, it could be in a superposition of moving towards the right and moving towards the left. Okay, fine, great, easy. Now, let's try that with the electron. What ingredient do we have to add? Well, it's not much harder. So here is the wave packet in a spin up that is about to move right. So what does it do? It moves right, okay? And here you have a C2 to which you can apply a small rotation, okay? So that's just rotating the vector by an angle theta, and this theta is basically the mass scaled by the lattice spacing here, okay? So what you do is, okay, so the particle moves, you rotate a little bit the C2 vector, okay, so this cosine is almost 1, so mostly the particle will continue to move, but there is a small sin theta amplitude of it going left, and then you iterate this process over and over. Okay? And that implements the Dirac equation. Right. So again, I think that's probably something that was easy for you. It wasn't so much for me. I want to enter the detail of that a little bit, just to fix the notation for making it a bit more complicated afterwards in the curved space-time case. Okay, so let's look at, as I said, how do you work things out? Well, you've got, for instance, for this guy, there is a number that comes from the left, a complex number that comes from the left, a complex number that comes from the right. That makes up a C2 vector, which you then rotate. Okay? That's the scheme. So let me write that as a circuit. What's happening is this, right? You have a complex number from the left, a complex number from the right, then you apply a little U2, and that gives you back two complex numbers, and so on. Okay? Just to fix notations, let's call these two numbers U and D up and down. So these are, U is a complex number, D is a complex number. Okay. Right. And the scale again is epsilon. Right. So let's derive this continuum limit. Let's pick just one of these little gates. Okay. So what does it see? Well, it sees some up and down components from the left, and here my minus epsilon should be on the x, and some up and down component from the right, and it gives rise to an up and down component at time t plus epsilon. Okay. Now let's just expand in epsilon. So I get my partial derivatives here. And first of all, the first thing I need to do for this to have at all a continuum limit is to set epsilon to 0. So all the gray terms go to 0. And so what this tells me is that the 0th order of my unitary matrix that I'm putting here, that should propagate that wire into here and that wire into here. Okay, so that for just the fact that I want to have a continuum limit forces me to have a unitary which is almost sigma x. Okay, just flips this guy and this guy. Right. So that's basically saying mostly the electron goes at the speed of light. Okay? And then what happens is that I look at the first order. So this D propagates here, so I will find it here, and it will cancel out with this guy. So I can just, I can remove the 0th order, and I can divide by epsilon. So let's really look at what's interesting in the first order. So in the first order, I see that the down component is propagating here, and this guy has a minus here. So the down component is propagating left, and the up component is propagating right. Okay, and then there is this first order expansion of my unitary that is still here, and that will multiply with U and D to add a W of UD. Okay, and here basically I recognize the Dirac equation in 1 + 1 dimension. It's just a matter of arranging so that this is a Pauli matrix, and that you can do precisely by taking this rotation, and when you expand it in epsilon, you get some Pauli matrix, and that's it. Okay. Right. So that's the outline of the proof that this little numerical scheme is just the Dirac equation. I personally was not a great believer in saying, let me look at the first order and things will work out magically. I was very suspicious about these kinds of approximations. So I needed convincing. And so I really looked, this was around, this is something that people like David Mayer had done, and Sauro Suchi, and several people. So, but I needed to convince myself about that. And I worked at really proving this in terms of convergence. Because there's this difference that you probably all know about between consistency and convergence. Okay, consistency is about saying, okay, this is time flowing upwards, right? I could have chosen epsilon, or I could have chosen an even finer epsilon prime. And consistency is about saying, whenever epsilon, as I go to a smaller epsilon, then my numerical scheme is even closer to the actual solution. Okay, that's consistency. But convergence is a bit harder, because convergence is when you say, I want to simulate my system for a fixed period of time, t. Okay, so what happens when I go from a certain epsilon to an even smaller epsilon prime? Well, somehow surely it's beneficial. I'm improving my accuracy, but somehow it's also detrimental because I have more steps to do. So there will be more errors accumulating. Okay, so convergence is a harder thing to prove. In fact, to address this, you need to have a well-posed equation. You need to have some norms to work with. And in the case of the Dirac equation, is the Sobolev norm. And you need to have a good PhD to whom you can throw this to calculate. And after 2 months, he will come back with 5/2. So the theorem says is that if your initial condition is in Sobolev norm bounded, then after any time t, you get a precision between the solution and what your numerical scheme gives you, which is in 5/2 t, the Sobolev norm of the initial condition, and the epsilon you've chosen. Okay.
It's epsilon to the 5. What's the meaning of that?
No, it's epsilon times 5/2. That's just a constant.
It's a constant.
Yeah, we worked out the constant. We so for those who don't know, the Sobolev norm is basically the sum of the L2 norm and the L2 norm of the derivative, and H2 is also you need to sum the L2 norm of the second derivative. So it's just controlling the derivatives. Anyway, that was fun, but
epsilon goes to 0. Let's say
yeah.
epsilon is 1. So there's no instability. You could take epsilon to 0, and then you'll get an exact answer. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes?
How do I see that you're updating the game that you described is unitary? How do I see that?
How do you see that? Because this is the formula for this is sigma x times c, where c is this rotation. So it's so this little box here is just a unitary. It's just a product of two unitaries. Well, it's perhaps not that explicit here, but it's basically xc. Right. Sigma x times c, and this is a rotation. This is an exponential of a Pauli matrix, which is also unitary. Yes?
So your epsilon plays the role of a delta t if I am in a more traditional numerical method?
Yeah, epsilon plays the role of a delta t and the delta x. We are scaling space and time the same way.
So it's order 1 convergence.
Yes. Okay. Right. Okay. But so this thing about computing the Sobolev norm, etc., was a bit painful, and now I'm willing to buy that you should just look at the first order in epsilon. But still, there is an interesting moral to it, which is that when you work out a quantum simulation algorithm, you have unitarity, and when you have unitarity, you have stability not only in L2 norm but also in Sobolev norm, and so you have. If you have a consistent and stable numerical scheme, then you have convergence for free by the Lax theorem, etc. Okay. Right. So let's move on to curved spacetime. So I have this reductionist picture. Here it's a grid, and you will say, look, fine, now you're putting quantum mechanics in, but what about relativity? Come on, I mean, this is just a fixed grid. So can you do it? So let's try and do it. Right. So what is exactly the challenge? Right now there is this. What I've shown you is a numerical scheme where things basically they go at light speed, at the speed of the lattice. Okay, there is this mass term that lets you lose some amplitude in the other direction, but really you could say that. In flat space, the electron follows really closely the lattice. Okay, and now the game is to be able to tune the speed, because really the Dirac equation in curved spacetime, when you look at the papers, it can be a bit scary, but in fact, when you put it into a Hamiltonian form and you think a bit about it, you find that really, it's all about being able to, put some speed limits here at every cell. That basically encode for the metric of the space-time. And these speed signs, they just say, okay, look, if you want to go towards the left, you're only allowed this speed, and if you want to go toward the right, okay, you can go at speed c. That's basically it. That's basically the story that the Dirac equation in curved spacetime is telling you. It's being able to tune the speed of propagation. Okay. Now, if I come back to the story I was telling you about the earlier numerical scheme in flat space, remember that I was saying, in order to have a continuum limit, you need the d to propagate there and the u to propagate there, and so in the 0th order, the coin here, the u2, it just needs to be sigma x. Okay, and if that's the case, then you look at the first order, and you find that, well, actually, then it means that dx will just move there, and minus dxu will just move there, and basically that will just force a minus sigma z to be here. So it will just force the speeds to be -1 and 1 in the Dirac equation. So what I'm saying here is that in the earlier numerical scheme, just the very condition that you need to have a continuum limit at all forces you to flat space. It forbids you to tune the speeds. Okay. Right. So what do you do then? Well, first of all, you do your bibliography. And these people from Pierre et Marie Curie, from Lerma, they worked out a scheme that starts to solve this problem. And and in fact, Giuseppe Di Molfetta, now we have recruited him in Aix-Marseille University, so he's in my group. Okay, so what was their idea? Their idea is okay, if you look at the one time step continuum limit, okay, it's impossible. We know it's impossible because of what I just said. But let's look at two time step of the walk. And what they did is they said, okay, I'm going to put any unitary there, and I'm going to ask for the numerical scheme to have a continuum limit, but after two time steps. They call it the stroboscopic technique. And okay, and it turns out that if you do that, you manage to tune the speed of propagation. You manage to tune this term, not quite arbitrarily. You can only have the same speed for the for the upper component and the down component. And it only works in the massless case. And okay, this was in 1 + 1, etc. But anyway, it turns out that okay, wow, it seems to be possible. Right. So what we did when we looked at this paper is we thought it's a bit strange to do this stroboscopic thing, to group every two time steps. A more natural thing to do is to, if you call this kind of circuits a quantum walk, a more natural thing to do is to group such that after you group, you are still an object of the same nature. You are still a quantum walk. Okay? And so that makes you want to group in space-time according to these I never remember the name in English. This losange. Okay. Well, okay. So basically, with our first idea was to stick big diamonds. Okay. Well, to stick big unitaries that are in fact taking two wires in from the left and from the right, and giving you back 4 wires. Okay, basically doubling up the dimension. Okay, so that's the first ingredient. Okay, and so let's look at what we can do with that. So you see now this unitary coin, this unitary, it's going to give you back psi at x minus epsilon and psi at x plus epsilon. So it's giving you back 2 points, right? And it's sampling psi at 2 points as well. Okay. And one thing that you can do is, okay, let's focus again. Each psi again is made of 2 complex numbers, right? The up and down component. So let's just look at the up component. The dotted guys are the down components, and we'll do the same to them. Let's look at the up components. So one thing you can do is to say, here I've got two samples of the up component. So I could do a little encoding here, which is a unitary encoding, just a Hadamard gate. A little encoding that will output on one wire the sum of the two components, and on the other wire the subtraction of the two components. And there is a square root 2 factor, which I'm dropping here, just because I don't have the space in the slide. But it's really a unitary operation. Okay? And so you see that up to a little recoding here, the fact that you're sampling your space twice lets you work out the derivative of the U scalar field and the average at that point of the U scalar field. So somehow, just by augmenting the dimension of your coin, you're kind of allowed to read out the derivatives of your fields. Okay. Right. So, but it's just a little recoding. So, so now let's work in that picture after this recoding. Okay. So what I'm saying is the walk now what it sees is the derivative of the up component and the derivative of the down component at x minus 2 epsilon, and the average of the up component and down component at x plus epsilon, and it needs to output the same thing at a later time. Okay. Right. And now let's look at the zero order. Let's hope that we have more freedom in choosing our W in the zero order than we had last time. And in the zero order, that will kill me the derivatives. It will kill the partial derivatives, of course. Okay. And what I find is that these two wires are again trivial. But this time, on these other wires, I'm allowed to do whatever I want. So it's looking good. It's looking like, by having a bigger coin, I'm allowed to do more things. Okay, but now let's look at the first order now. So I know that my W is of this form, and I look at the first order. So in the first order, again, from here I see the derivatives, and then there are derivatives of derivatives that I drop. Here I've got these well, I think it should be a plus here, but these up and down components. Okay, and it turns out that here I see that again, I have to have U prime and D prime coming into this wire, and I need to output U prime and D prime again, just for consistency, just so that the derivatives remain the derivatives. Okay, and so that will kill me. That will kill my little U here, and that's saying again that W needs to be trivial. Okay, so just to tell you the final idea, and I will be done. I cannot dive much more into the detail, but the thing that saves you is if you say, okay, I could introduce a little piece of pre-encoding of my input data, which is a little unitary that I apply everywhere. And at the end, I decode. Okay. And doing that is not a big deal, because if I iterate my scheme in space-time, these E dagger and E here, they will cancel out, right? Because they're unitary. And so I'm basically saying, you give me some input data, you do a little bit of an encoding, then you apply this bigger coin, then you decode, And that's the extra ingredient that you need. And then you can prove consistency, and you can prove that tuning these W's, you can get to any of these equations. Okay, it's just and then it's just mathematics. There. Right. Okay. So once you've done that, you can play with it. So here is a little simulation where you have a Robertson-Walker spacetime, which is basically a spacetime that is contracting. And here it's a massless Dirac particle. The shading, the coloring here is our numerical simulation. And the yellow lines are the geodesics that are worked out analytically. So that they are just to show the agreement and the fact that this massless particle will propagate indeed along the light-like geodesic of the Robertson-Walker spacetime. Here, the initial condition is prepared according to a Gaussian wave packet, so that this quantum particle behaves as classically as possible, right? So, okay. And here is another simulation. So this is the horizon of Schwarzschild black hole. This is okay. So this is space. This is time. Of course, there are no black holes in 1+1, but you can just take the solution of 3+1 and project it there. Okay, and then we throw again a Gaussian wave packet, and this time we've prepared we've run it with a mass, right? So this is the light-like geodesic, but here the electron is falling into the black hole a little bit slower because it has a mass. Okay. Right. So the conclusion of my first talk, because there is a second one coming, right? Because I have an hour, right? No? Or
Well, you have 20 minutes left.
right. Okay. So the conclusion of my first talk is that we can indeed code for non-interacting physics particle in Kerr spacetime as a quantum walk on the lattice. So local unitary operations on a lattice. Why would you do that? Okay, it just gives you a stable numerical scheme. If you have a quantum simulation device to implement it, then you can run it into a quantum simulation device that will mimic the phenomena that is not so easy to experiment with. I mean, it's not easy to throw an electron in a black hole and see what happens. And, well, there is also this grander motivation, or I don't know, this idea that maybe we can see better what the electron does, understand better the theory by having this discrete version of it. Okay.
We could do questions on the first
Yes,
first.
I think that's good.
Why don't I come up and then we'll see what's left for the second one. See your question already.
Can you build the numerical schemes of arbitrary accuracy? Arbitrary order? I mean.
Well, it's well. So for this scheme, we haven't proven convergence. We just know that it's consistent.
But it's order one.
It's order one, and I don't know how.
Can you
No, I don't know how to go up.
Other questions?
I just have like a short question. If do you have any idea how can I implement this in a system? Let's imagine that I have my half wave plates or something like that. That normally I will take a photon, and if I want to do it in a photonic system, then I want to put it in a superposition. That will be my first part of the quantum world. It's a discrete quantum world, right?
Mm.
So I will have this preparation in the superposition of state, and then my beam displacer will tell me that it goes to the right or to the left. Here, I don't see in the coin that you have, you included both things, the superposition, I mean the preparation and the superposition of the state and then the shifting, or I don't know.
Okay,
what would you need
so
to do
actual implementation of these things. The one in curve space-time, you know, it's complicated. You have to be able to do these U4 unitaries. That may be very hard, although not fundamentally different from the flat space case. The flat space case, these are things that people are capable of implementing already, although not very accurately, but they can, and they do that in a number of ways. You have ion trap people like Blatt, who have been simulating the Dirac equation on their ions and observed the Zitterbewegung phenomenon that you should observe, etc. You have people like Thomas Mechede and Andrea Alberti from Bonn, who work with cold atoms in optical lattices, and if the atom is excited, it's sensitive to one optical lattice or another, and so according to its excitation, when they move the optical lattices, that propagates the atom in a coherent superposition of left and right, and then you can implement local unitaries on the atom by shining something to it. I don't know. I'm not an experimentalist.
Okay, so this will be more engineering, the Hamiltonian, and
Yes.
see the evolution.
Yes.
Not just discrete quantum what you need, like really.
You have actual system that implement these unitaries in practice. Another one is this integrated optics people that can actually print with a laser these optics path, and then they shine a laser, and the photon will follow in this path. It will follow a quantum walk. So these are ways that people are implementing quantum walks nowadays.
In the flat space, your numerical scheme can be reinterpreted as a upwind scheme for the linear transport equation with a limiting CFL. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Delta t over delta x equal 1. So when you go to the curve space, and this is a bit dangerous because if you in the linear case, if you increase a little bit delta t, then you blow up. Okay, and so in the curve space, if you as the velocity will change from cell to cell, it's not completely clear that you will have stability because you are borderline at each step. Is it clear what I mean?
Okay, so what is certain is that you need this condition here, right? Which basically says that the eigenvalues of B are less than 1.
Yeah, but if they are equal to 1, then you may have problems of in the long time limit. No?
In the precise case, when they are equal to 1 and minus 1, there is no problem, and this is what we've shown. Right, but for this scheme, yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer such precise questions. Right.
Okay, so this works for a scalar equation too? Because here you do not really specify.
The dimension.
So I just want to be sure that there is existence and uniqueness which is global without any additional conditions on decay.
Yeah, it works for the scalar case. Yes. In fact, we've looked at it.
If I take decay of x and t equals to okay, so E, I'm not so sure that you don't need an additional condition for because you can have a region when there is no characteristics. It's not possible.
No characteristics.
Well,
What does that say?
If you have a transport, okay, with a function with pk that depends on x and t or
Right.
constant or whatever, to prove the existence of a unique solution which is global, you have to be sure that for any point in space and time, you have a unique characteristic that goes to this point. Right?
Okay.
And for that, you have unique conditions on the function, right? The function dk. So, because you may have some cases there is no there's a whole region when there is no characteristic won't have a solution for every X and
Right.
in R cross factors.
I think I cannot answer on these questions. I mean, what we've shown is it's consistent and it's unitary. That's all I can say, really.
If P is regular, it will be okay, right?
If you take a function of P of X and T, you can find you have to find a unique solution to your characteristic equation.
Yeah.
And no, you need a condition to have a unique solution.
So we might have to take that offline. By the way, your curvature, when you get positive or negative curvature, is that allowed in your simulation? I wasn't clear on how you restricted curvature.
Okay, so what's obvious to me is that that's the only restriction on the equation, that this is Hermitian, but how this relates directly to the curvature. Basically, I think it just needs to be Lorentzian with Lorentzian.
What do you mean by be a Lorentzian?
You just need to have the eigenvalues of your metric just need to be minus something and then positive
Okay.
stuff.
So it's the metric.
And if you work out the maximum speed, it should be less or equal to 1.
Yeah, your Lorentz group has 4 disjoint regions. Okay, yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, but the one when time goes in the right direction, where you cannot. Okay.
No time reversal.
Right.
Okay, any questions on the first talk before you start the second talk? So you only have 10 minutes.
Good.
Are you sure you want to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. But it,